Welcome to Fearful Frequencies, where every story is a signal from the shadows. Tune in if you dare, and let the whispers of the unknown send chills down your spine. But beware, once you hear the haunting echoes of these tales, you may never listen to the silence the same way again. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing on Patreon at www.patreon.com/fearfulfrequencies. Link in description. So in the dead of night, when the world is silent and shadows grow long, there are frequencies that tap into our deepest fears. Gather yourself and listen. This story is called The Svalbard Anomaly, Part 1. The wind outside the Åkerholm research facility screamed like a living thing, slamming against the reinforced glass windows of the observation deck with a ferocity that made the structure groan under the pressure. Even after months of hearing the endless howling of the Arctic wind, it still unsettled Nathan Drake. It had a way of making him feel exposed, vulnerable, as if the cold was a sentient force constantly probing for weaknesses in the facility's defenses. Nathan stood at the window, staring out over the desolate, frozen expanse that stretched endlessly in every direction. The white wasteland was unbroken, save for the jagged black rocks that jutted out of the ice like the bones of some long-dead creature. Svalbard had a way of getting under your skin, of making you feel small and insignificant in the face of its eternal winter. There were days when it was easy to forget that there was a world beyond the ice, a world of sun and warmth and life. Not here. Not in this place. Åkerholm Research Facility was one of the most remote outposts on the planet, perched on the edge of the Arctic Circle, far from civilization. Its purpose was to study the ancient ice, to drill deep into the permafrost and recover samples that might hold secrets from Earth's distant past. Nathan had been drawn to the project by the challenge of it, the promise of discovery. As a molecular biologist specializing in virology, he had been fascinated by the possibility of finding ancient microorganisms frozen in time. But now, after months of isolation, the weight of the mission and the isolation was starting to bear down on him. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Dr. Rachel Adler entering the observation deck. She was carrying a tablet, her brow furrowed as she scrolled through some report or another. Rachel had been his closest colleague at the facility, and over time their professional relationship had evolved into a kind of unspoken friendship. She was sharp, practical, and always seemed to be a step ahead in a crisis. "You're up early," Rachel said without looking up from her tablet. She pushed her glasses up her nose, her auburn hair falling in loose curls around her face. "Couldn't sleep," Nathan replied, turning back to the window. "Same reason as always. Too quiet. Too still." Rachel chuckled softly, her voice tinged with amusement. "You're in one of the most isolated places on Earth, Nathan. You didn't expect bustling city noise, did you?" Nathan smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "No, I expected this. But it feels different lately, like the silence isn't just from the outside." Rachel looked up at him, her face softening slightly. "You've been saying that for a while now. You sure it's not just the isolation getting to you? Cabin fever is a real thing, especially in places like this." Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them. Dr. Elias Hauge appeared in the doorway, looking even more sleep-deprived than usual. His short, graying hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Elias was the facility's lead microbiologist, and his expertise in ancient pathogens had been one of the key reasons he was selected for the mission. He was usually composed and meticulous, but today he looked deeply troubled. "Elias," Rachel said, raising an eyebrow, "you look like you've been up all night." "I have," Elias replied, his voice tense. "I've been working on the ice core samples from the last extraction. I need to show you something." "Now." Rachel glanced at Nathan, who immediately sensed the urgency in Elias's tone. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Without a word, they both followed Elias down the narrow corridor toward the facility's laboratory. The lab was sterile and cold, a series of white-walled rooms filled with high-tech equipment designed to analyze and contain any potential pathogens or biological samples they uncovered. Elias led them to one of the back rooms, where the latest ice core sample sat in a quarantine chamber. The core was a long cylinder of dark, dense ice, recovered from deep within the permafrost, ancient, preserved perfectly for millennia. Nathan had seen dozens of these samples since the project began, but something about this one was different. The ice seemed darker, more opaque, as if something was trapped inside it. Elias pulled up a chair and gestured for them to look at the monitor that displayed the sample's cellular activity. "I've been running tests on this for the past 48 hours, Elias said, his voice tight with exhaustion. At first, it seemed like a standard frozen microbe, a remnant of some ancient life form, likely extinct for thousands of years. But then, yesterday, it started to change." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the data on the screen. "What kind of change?" "The cells are active," Elias replied, shaking his head in disbelief. "At first, I thought it was some kind of contamination, maybe something in the equipment. But I've triple-checked everything. These cells are not only alive, they're evolving. Rapidly." Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. "Evolving? How is that possible? This thing's been frozen in the ice for thousands of years." "I don't know," Elias admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But it's happening, and it's not behaving like any pathogen or organism we've ever encountered. It's mutating, adapting, and it's doing it far faster than anything should be capable of." Rachel's eyes widened as she looked at the data. "This doesn't make sense. No known organism could survive in these conditions, let alone adapt and evolve at this rate." "That's what worries me," Elias said. "Whatever this is, it doesn't follow the rules of modern biology. And the more I study it, the more I think it might be something far older, something ancient, something we were never meant to find." Nathan exchanged a glance with Rachel, a knot forming in his stomach. Elias was not the type to exaggerate. If he was this concerned, it meant they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. "Have you contained it?" Nathan asked, his voice tight. "Yes, for now," Elias replied. "But we need to keep it quarantined until we can figure out what we're dealing with. If this thing gets out—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew the potential danger. Rachel nodded grimly. "We'll keep it under lockdown. No one goes near that sample until we know what it is and how to stop it." But Nathan's mind was already racing. If this organism was as dangerous as Elias feared, then they were sitting on a biological time bomb. And in the middle of the Arctic, cut off from the rest of the world, they were entirely on their own. Hours passed and the team reconvened in the facility's common area. The atmosphere was tense, each person lost in their thoughts about the discovery in the lab. The usual hum of idle conversation was absent, replaced by a heavy silence. Even Jonas, the facility's mechanic and handyman, who was known for his gruff humor, sat quietly at the table, occasionally glancing around the room as if expecting something to happen. Jonas was a burly man in his early 40s, with a thick beard and a no-nonsense attitude. He had spent years working in isolated environments, and while he wasn't a scientist, his practical skills had made him an invaluable member of the team. But now even he seemed uneasy. "This doesn't sit right with me," Jonas muttered, breaking the silence. "If that thing in the lab is as dangerous as you're saying, shouldn't we be evacuating?" Rachel shook her head. "We can't. The weather's too severe, and HQ hasn't responded to any of our messages for days. We're cut off." "We're always cut off," Jonas grumbled, stabbing at his food with a fork. "That's the nature of this place." "But it's not just the weather this time," Nathan said quietly. I've been trying to get the communication systems back online, but there's nothing. It's like we're being jammed. Jammed? Jonas raised an eyebrow. By what? There's no one for miles. That's what I can't figure out, Nathan replied. It's not just a malfunction. Something is actively blocking our signal. Elias, who had been sitting silently at the table, finally spoke up. I don't think this is a coincidence. Whatever's in that ice core, it's not just a biological anomaly. It's something more deliberate. What do you mean, deliberate? Sarah asked, her voice soft but urgent. Sarah was the youngest member of the team, in her mid-20s, with a bright mind and an eagerness that had served her well in the early months of the project. But now even she was starting to show signs of wear. Elias hesitated, his eyes shifting to the floor. I've been looking into ancient myths and folklore from this region. There are stories, old stories, about things buried beneath the ice. Creatures that slumber for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. I didn't think much of it at first, but now I'm starting to wonder if there's some truth to those legends. Rachel frowned. You're saying this thing is, what, some kind of mythical creature? I'm saying it doesn't fit any known biological or scientific model, Elias replied. And if we're going to understand it, we need to think beyond the limits of modern science. A heavy silence followed Elias's words. The idea of dealing with something beyond science, something that defied everything they knew, was not easy to grasp. But there was no denying the facts. The organism in the lab wasn't just unusual, it was terrifyingly unpredictable. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, let's focus. For now, we treat this like any other biological threat. The lab is quarantined, and we keep a close eye on the sample's activity. No one goes near it unless absolutely necessary. Agreed, Nathan said, though his mind kept drifting back to the organism's unnatural evolution. Something about it felt deliberate, as though it were aware of their presence, adapting to their every move. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The group dispersed, each returning to their duties with a sense of grim determination. But the unspoken fear lingered in the air, like a shadow creeping closer with each passing hour. Nathan sat alone in the control room later that evening, the soft glow of monitors casting long shadows across the room. He was trying, yet again, to re-establish communication with HQ, but the interference persisted. The same error messages flashed on the screen, taunting him with their unyielding consistency. Signal blocked, unable to connect. He leaned back in his chair, massaging the back of his neck as frustration mounted. He couldn't shake the sense that something was intentionally severing their link to the outside world, and the thought gnawed at him. If they couldn't get help from HQ, they were on their own. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the facility's metal framework with renewed force. Nathan found himself staring out the window, watching the darkness beyond the glass. The perpetual night of the Arctic winter had a way of distorting time. Hours felt like days, and the blackness outside seemed endless, suffocating. A movement in the reflection of the window caught his eye. He sat up, squinting at the glass. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw it again. A dark shape moving in the corridor behind him. He spun around, his pulse quickening, but the hallway was empty. The faint hum of the facility's ventilation system was the only sound, and the red emergency lights cast eerie shadows along the walls. Nathan stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed a flashlight from the control panel and stepped into the corridor, shining the beam of light down the hallway. The flickering red lights created a disorienting effect, making the shadows seem to writhe and shift as he moved. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. As he approached the lab's containment chamber, he hesitated. The reinforced door was closed, just as it had been earlier, but something felt off. A faint sound reached his ears, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the distant murmur of machinery. But this sound wasn't mechanical. It was organic, alive, and it was coming from inside the lab. Nathan's throat tightened. He pressed his ear against the cold metal of the door, straining to hear. The hum grew louder, more distinct. It was a pulsating rhythm, almost like the heartbeat of some enormous, unseen creature. He pulled back, his pulse racing. Whatever was happening inside that lab, it wasn't normal. Just as he was about to turn away, a loud crash echoed from within the lab, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. Nathan froze, his mind reeling. The containment unit. It had been breached. Without thinking, he hit the emergency lockdown button on the wall, sealing the lab's doors with a hiss of pressurized air. Alarms blared throughout the facility, and red lights began flashing in every hallway. "Nathan!" Rachel's voice came through the intercom, sharp with alarm. "What's going on? Is it the lab?" Nathan grabbed the nearest intercom unit, his voice shaking as he replied. "The containment unit's been breached. I don't know how, but something's loose in there. We need to lock down the whole facility now." Rachel's voice was tense but controlled. "I'm on it. Get back to the control room. We'll regroup there." Nathan didn't need to be told twice. He turned and sprinted down the hallway, the alarms blaring in his ears. As he reached the control room, he found the rest of the team already gathered. Rachel was at the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she initiated the lockdown protocols. Elias stood near the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How did it breach the containment unit? It was secure. I checked everything." "I don't know," Nathan said, breathing heavily. "But it's spreading. Whatever that thing is, it's not just evolving. It's growing, and it's fast." Sarah, who had been pacing nervously, stopped in her tracks. "Are we trapped in here with it?" "We're safe for now," Rachel replied, her voice tight with concentration. "I've sealed the lab and locked down all non-essential areas of the facility. But we need to figure out how to stop it before it spreads any further." "Can't we just destroy it?" Jonas asked, his usual bravado tempered by the situation. Elias shook his head. "It's not that simple. We don't even know what it is yet, or how it's able to survive. If we make the wrong move, we could make things worse." Nathan clenched his fists, his mind racing. The organism wasn't just a biological anomaly. It was something far more dangerous, something that had no place in the modern world, and they were completely unprepared to deal with it. Rachel turned to the group, her expression grim. "All right. Here's what we're going to do. Nathan, you stay here and monitor the systems. Elias, I need you to go back to the lab and gather any data you can on the organism's current state. We need to understand it before we can stop it. Jonas, Sarah, you two check the ventilation systems and make sure the organism hasn't spread into the air ducts. We'll meet back here in an hour." Nathan nodded, though the idea of splitting up made him uneasy. But Rachel was right. They couldn't just sit here and wait for the situation to escalate. They had to take action, and fast. As the others dispersed, Nathan returned to the control panel, his fingers hovering over the keys. The warning messages still flashed on the screen, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. "External breach detected." The phrase sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just the lab that had been breached. Something had gotten inside the facility, and it was moving faster than any of them had anticipated. Nathan glanced at the security cameras, cycling through the various angles of the facility's interior. The red lights bathed every corridor in an eerie glow, and for a moment, everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Then, on one of the monitors, he saw it. A dark shape moving in the shadows of the lab, shifting and writhing as it crept along the floor. The organism was no longer confined to the containment unit. It had spread, its tendrils crawling across the walls and ceiling like some grotesque living web. Nathan's stomach twisted with dread. He reached for the intercom, his voice shaking as he called out to the others. "Elias! Rachel! Get out of the lab! Now!" Elias and Rachel were halfway to the lab when Nathan's voice came through the intercom. They stopped in their tracks, exchanging a look of alarm. "What is it?" Elias asked, his hand tightening around the flashlight he carried. "The organism. It's out of containment. It's spreading through the lab," Nathan's voice crackled through the intercom. "You need to get out of there, now." Rachel cursed under her breath, turning to Elias. "We need to go back." But before they could retreat, the sound of something slithering echoed from the hallway ahead. Rachel raised her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but the source of the sound remained just out of reach. A low, rumbling growl reverberated through the walls, sending a wave of fear through both of them. Elias took a step back, his voice trembling. "It's here." Before they could react, the creature lunged from the shadows, its tendrils whipping through the air with unnatural speed. Rachel screamed as one of the tendrils lashed out, narrowly missing her as she dove to the side. Elias wasn't as lucky. The tendrils wrapped around his arm, pulling him toward the writhing mass. "Elias!" Rachel cried, scrambling to her feet. Elias struggled against the creature's grip, his face contorted in pain as the tendrils tightened around him. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice strained. "Go! Now!" Rachel hesitated, her heart racing, but the sight of the creature enveloping Elias forced her into action. She turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted back toward the control room. The alarms blared louder in her ears, the red lights flashing faster as if mirroring the panic in her chest. She didn't stop until she burst through the door of the control room, slamming it shut behind her. Nathan looked up from the monitors, his face pale. "Where's Elias?" Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. They were losing control. And whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it consumed everything. Rachel leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, her mind racing through the last few minutes. Elias was gone, taken by the thing that had escaped from the lab. The creature, or whatever it was far more dangerous and intelligent than any of them had anticipated. Nathan's eyes were glued to the monitors, his fingers frozen on the keyboard. "We need to shut down the ventilation system," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "If it gets into the ducts, it'll spread to every corner of the facility." Rachel nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Elias, his last moments, his agonized expression as he was dragged away by the tendrils. She felt a pang of guilt. She had run, leaving him behind. She had no choice, but the weight of it was already heavy on her conscience. "I'll help Jonas and Sarah," she said, straightening up. "They should be at the ventilation access points by now. We need to make sure it hasn't already spread." Nathan glanced at her, worry etched into his face. "Be careful. That thing is moving fast." Rachel swallowed hard and nodded, then grabbed a flashlight from the wall. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead, and then hurried out of the control room. The halls felt tighter, the flickering red lights and alarms disorienting her as she ran. She tried to focus on the task at hand, find Jonas and Sarah, stop the spread of the organism, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the image of Elias being pulled into the shadows. This wasn't what any of them had signed up for. In the lower levels of the facility, Jonas and Sarah were crouched by the access panel to the ventilation system. Jonas had pried open the metal grate with a crowbar, his thick hands shaking slightly as he worked. Sarah held the flashlight, her face pale, her usual calm demeanor replaced with nervous energy. "You think it's already in the vents?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting around the narrow corridor. Jonas grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let's hope not. But if it is, we need to shut these down and fast. Otherwise, that thing's gonna be crawling through the walls like a goddamn rat." He tossed the metal grate aside and reached into the dark opening, feeling for the manual override switch that would seal off the vents. His fingers found the lever and he yanked it down with a grunt of effort. A loud clunk echoed through the facility as the ventilation system began to shut down. "There," Jonas said, standing up and dusting off his hands. "That should slow it down." But before they could relax, a strange sound reverberated through the vents, like a wet, slithering movement, growing louder by the second. Sarah froze, her flashlight trembling in her hands. "Did you hear that?" Jonas nodded slowly, his eyes widening. The sound was unmistakable. The organism was in the ducts, moving toward them with terrifying speed. "Shit," Jonas muttered. "We need to get out of here." They turned and sprinted down the hallway, but the sound of the creature's movement grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right on top of them. Jonas threw a glance over his shoulder just in time to see the metal grate at the far end of the hall burst open. Black, writhing tendrils spilled out, slithering across the floor and walls, moving with horrifying speed. "Run!" Jonas shouted, pushing Sarah ahead of him. They raced down the corridor, the creature gaining ground with every second. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself harder, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She could hear the tendrils scraping against the metal walls, feel the cold air rushing past her as they sprinted toward the elevator. But it wasn't fast enough. One of the tendrils lashed out, catching Jonas's ankle and yanking him off his feet with a brutal force. He hit the ground hard, his shout of pain echoing through the hall. "Jonas!" Sarah cried, turning back, her heart sinking at the sight of him struggling against the creature's grip. "Go!" Jonas shouted, his face contorted in pain as the tendril coiled around his leg, pulling him toward the mass of black, shifting flesh that was now pouring out of the ventilation system. "Get out of here!" But Sarah couldn't move. She watched in horror as the tendrils wrapped around Jonas, pulling him closer and closer to the writhing mass that was spilling into the corridor. His eyes met hers, and for a moment they were filled with a mix of fear and resignation. Then, with a final, desperate shout, Jonas disappeared into the creature's embrace. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she turned and ran, tears streaming down her face. She didn't stop until she reached the elevator, slamming her hand against the button to call it. The doors opened with a hiss, and she stumbled inside, her body trembling from the adrenaline and shock. As the elevator doors slid shut, the sound of the creature's movement grew faint, but the terror in her chest remained. Jonas was gone, and now it was only a matter of time before the organism spread to the rest of the facility. Sarah leaned against the wall of the elevator, her mind racing. She couldn't let this thing win. They had to find a way to stop it, to contain it before it was too late. The elevator doors opened on the upper level, and Sarah stepped out into the corridor, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She had to find Rachel and Nathan. They needed to know what had happened. They needed a plan. Nathan was still at the control panel when Sarah stumbled into the room, her face pale, her body shaking. He looked up in alarm as she collapsed into a chair, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "Sarah, what happened?" he asked, rushing over to her. "It's in the vents," she gasped, her voice trembling. "It took Jonas. He didn't make it." Nathan's stomach dropped. He had known Jonas for years, his gruff exterior hiding a good man who had always been there to fix whatever went wrong in the facility. And now he was gone, taken by the organism. Rachel entered the room moments later, her expression grim. "What's going on?" Sarah wiped the tears from her face, struggling to find her voice. "The organism. It's spreading through the vents. Jonas tried to shut them down, but it got to him before we could finish. We're running out of time." Rachel clenched her jaw, her mind working through the situation. "We need to seal off the lower levels, contain it down there, and then figure out how to destroy it. Nathan nodded, but the weight of the situation was pressing down on him. They had lost 2 members of their team in the span of an hour, and the organism was spreading faster than they could contain it. If they didn't act quickly, it would overrun the entire facility. "I'll start sealing the lower levels," Nathan said, turning back to the control panel. "But we need a way to kill it. Containing it isn't going to be enough." Rachel nodded, her expression dark. "We'll find a way. We have to." As Nathan began working on the controls, Rachel and Sarah exchanged a look. The fear in Sarah's eyes mirrored the dread that Rachel felt deep in her gut. This thing, whatever it was, had already taken 2 of their friends, and it wasn't going to stop. But as Rachel turned to look at the monitors, something caught her eye, a dark shape moving through the corridors on the lower level. It wasn't the organism, it was something else, something human. "Wait," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at that." Nathan and Sarah turned to the monitor, their eyes widening in disbelief. There, on the screen, was a figure moving through the lower corridors. It was Elias. But Elias was supposed to be dead. The figure moved with a slow, jerky gait, as if it were struggling to stay upright. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, and its arms dragged limply at its sides. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with horror. "Elias is—" Nathan's hands hovered over the controls, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Elias. Not anymore. The figure on the monitor stopped, turning its head slowly to face the camera. Its eyes were dark, empty, and filled with something far more terrifying than death. It was watching them,